You got one?
No, I don't. Let's see.
Yeah, I've got it here.
Oh, okay. I was going to write it down.
Order. Order. We now move on to a debate about human rights in West Papua, and I call on Robert Courts to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Hollowbone. It's an honour to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon, and I beg to move that this House has considered human rights in West Papua. I'm delighted to have been granted this extremely important debate upon human rights in West Papua. This is, in fact, the first ever, as I understand it, debate in the House of Commons upon this topic, and I'm pleased to see and welcome colleagues from all across the House who have come to support the debate today, and I'm grateful to them. There have been a couple of brief debates in the other place over the years, but the fact is that this is the first time that we, as elected representatives, have debated West Papua, despite holding some 3,455 debates in the last 50 years on issues great and small, of national and local significance, and it is perhaps illustrative of the lack of attention that this issue has received when it ought to have done, both at home and in the international community. And I hope that today, in our small way, we can start to shine a light on the West Papuan cause and to give a voice to the people of West Papua. Well, I reference the last 50 years as there is, in fact, a significance to the fact that this first ever debate taking place now is when 2019 marks the 50th anniversary of the so-called Act of Free Choice, which is a defining moment in the West Papuan story and the context within which the current situation in West Papua must be viewed. And if I may, Mr Hollowbone, I will start by setting out some of the context and a brief history of West Papua before discussing the current situation. And I'll conclude, if I may, with two key actions that I would like to suggest the UK government might consider taking in order to help improve the human rights situation in West Papua. Delighted.
I thank him for giving way before he starts on his historical expose, but just to set the current situation into context, because this is the situation that he is coming round to describing. Is he aware of the two human rights situations? The first, which was illustrated on a video that went viral, which was of a West Papuan freedom fighter being tortured with a snake by the Indonesian army. And is he aware that as a result of the Indonesian activities in Nduga, there have been just there 30,000 refugees created?
I'm very grateful to the honourable member for making that intervention. I am aware of both of those the fact in the incident, and it really illustrates in microcosm the importance of the debate that we are holding today, as he has given such vivid examples of what is happening in this very day in West Papua. Mr Hollowbone, West Papua is the western half of New Guinea, the second largest island on Earth, and it is one of the many of thousands of South Pacific islands which are collectively known as Melanesia. Papuan people have inhabited the West Papua region for over 40,000 years. It was slowly drawn into the Dutch sphere of influence, and by the end of the 19th century, the Dutch had established permanent administrative centres in the region as part of the Dutch East Indies. When Indonesian nationalists declared independence from the Dutch Empire in 1945, they included West Papua in the list of territories that would form the newly born country. This declaration sparked a 4-year-long war between the Indonesians and the Dutch, which ended in 1949 when Indonesia was granted international recognition as an independent state at the Hague Round Table Conference. However, this only heightened the divisions that existed on the status of the West Papua region. Indonesia argued that the region should be included in their new independent state, but the Dutch refused to cede that territory. And it's at this point that I ought to mention the West Papua region is home to the largest gold mine and the second largest copper mine in the world. No compromise was found in the years that followed Indonesian independence, leading to a further fraying of tensions between Indonesia and the Netherlands, which led to Indonesia building up its military capacity, largely from weapons acquired from the Soviet Union. In the conflict that ensued, the United States, although originally supportive of the Dutch cause, eventually changed their position to ensure that, in the context of the Cold War, of course, Indonesia would not be driven towards the Soviet Union. Talks between Indonesia and the Netherlands followed in 1962, with the UN acting as the official mediating power. This resulted in the signing of the New York Agreement, according to which the administration of West Papua would be assigned to the United Nations for a minimum of 7 months before being passed to Indonesia. Crucially, Article 18 of the agreement stipulated, and I read, that Indonesia will make arrangements with the assistance and participation of the United Nations representative and his staff to give the people of the territory the opportunity to exercise freedom of choice. Further, that such arrangements will include formulation of the questions in such a way as to permit the inhabitants to decide A, whether they wish to remain with Indonesia, or B, whether they wish to sever their ties with Indonesia. Article 18 also noted that the consultation must ensure the eligibility of all adults, male and female, not foreign nationals, to participate in the act of self-determination to be carried out in accordance with international practice.
I'm extremely grateful to you for giving way and for securing this debate, a very important debate. I've long held an interest in West Papua, going back maybe 15, 16 years in a previous life. And isn't that the root cause or the root issue at hand is self-determination, which is an international human right. And for any government, including the British government, to have an ethical foreign policy protecting that vital human right is very important.
Yes. Thank you. I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for making that point. It's a fundamental human right, that of self-determination. It has been, of course, for many hundreds of years, most famously, of course, enunciated at the beginning of the 20th century after the First World War, and it is a principle, a guiding principle in foreign policy of all countries, but particularly of the United Kingdom since that time. And, of course, self-determination is at the heart of the issue that we are discussing this afternoon. I'm grateful to him for making that point to us. It's difficult to say that what happened in 1969, the so-called Act of Free Choice, was indeed an act which carried out in accordance with international practice, or which captured the true democratic will of the West Papuan people. Despite the New York Agreement explicitly requiring Indonesia to guarantee fully the rights, including the rights of free speech, free movement and of assembly of the inhabitants of the area, this was not fulfilled, as at the time of the Act of Free Choice, Papuan political parties were banned. A one-person, one-vote system, which is international practice, was not granted, but instead 1,025 representatives were selected by the Indonesian military to vote on behalf of the Papuan people. The representatives voted unanimously in favour of Papua becoming part of Indonesia. However, numerous reports from foreign observers and Papuans suggest that it was not a free consultation. It is claimed that those who were selected for the vote were blackmailed into voting against independence with threats of violence against their person and their families, with representatives taken away from their families and communities for several weeks before the consultation. Diplomatic cables from the US ambassador to Indonesia reported at the time that, and again I read, the act of free choice in West Papua is unfolding like a Greek tragedy, the conclusion preordained. The Indonesians cannot and will not permit any resolution other than continued inclusion of West Papua in Indonesia. Dissident activity is likely to increase as the climax is reached, but the Indonesian armed forces will be able to contain it and, if necessary, suppress it. He continued, the Indonesian armed forces has no intention of allowing West Papuan choice other than incorporation into Indonesia. Separation is unthinkable. British diplomats in the region took similar views and drew similar conclusions at the time. In a House of Lords debate back in 2004, the then Foreign Office Minister Baroness Symonds made the admission, in responding to the former Bishop of Oxford, that he is right to say that there were 1,000 hand-picked representatives and that they were largely coerced into declaring for inclusion in Indonesia. I'd be interested to hear in due course from the Minister whether it's still the position of the UK government, although I see no reason for that to have changed at this stage. Baroness Symonds, after making this admission, went on to say that this occurred many decades ago, and rather than dwell on the past, it is important to look to the future and improve matters in the here and now. Whilst I have some sympathy with this sentiment, it does perhaps miss the key point, namely that, in the eyes of many West Papuans, the fundamental questions about the legitimacy of the so-called act of free choice undermines the very legitimacy of Indonesian rule in West Papua. We are now in the 50th anniversary year of the act of free choice, which is understandably seen as an act of great injustice by the people of West Papua, who ironically refer to it as the act of no choice. And in the last 50 years, the West Papuan people have been subjected to serious human rights violations, which have only fueled and heightened this sense of injustice. These human rights violations include the repression of free speech and peaceful assembly, impediment to a free press, arbitrary arrest, and even cases of torture and killings, as we have heard. These human rights abuses in West Papua are in large part down to the fact that the regime and the rights are de facto controlled by the Indonesian military. The University of Sydney has estimated that around 15,000 troops are currently deployed in the region. When human rights violations occur, there is an inadequate system of redress for Papuans, so violations often go unpunished. An Amnesty International report on West Papua noted that there is a lack of effort to investigate accusations of human rights violations and to try before civilian courts police officials accused of violations. Furthermore, that allegations of human rights abuses committed by the military in West Papua often go unchecked or are dealt with before military tribunals with no transparency, leaving many victims of human rights violations awaiting justice. We will all be aware of the case from earlier this year, as we've heard from the Honourable Member from Henley, when footage emerged of Indonesian police interrogating a young Papuan boy who was on the floor and in handcuffs while officers wrapped a large snake around him. The child was alleged to have stolen a mobile phone, and in the video is heard screaming in fear as officers laugh and push the snake's head towards his face. In responding to the incident, the UN panel of human rights experts stated that the case reflects a widespread pattern of violence, alleged arbitrary arrests and detention, as well as methods amounting to torture used by the Indonesian police and military in Papua. They continue to explain that these tactics are often used against indigenous Papuans and that the incident is symptomatic of the discrimination West Papuans face by the Indonesian authorities. Papuans are regularly arrested for peacefully expressing their opinions on the political status of West Papua, including through peaceful demonstrations or attending meetings in which this matter is discussed. The simple act of raising the symbol of West Papuan independence, the Morning Star, perhaps even just lifting the flag given to you, carries a prison sentence of up to 15 years. Pro-independence political leaders have routinely faced persecution and even assassination at the hands of Indonesian authorities. And it's at this point, Mr. Hollowbone, if I may, that I would like to introduce someone who I am pleased to say is in attendance today. Benny Wenda, leader of United Liberation Movement of West Papua, came to see me recently, along with my constituent, Richard Samuelson, who was the first person to bring the situation in West Papua to my attention, and his fiancée, Elaine, who is also here in attendance today, and I thank them. I'd like to pay tribute to Richard, if I may, for bringing this matter to my attention, which, if I may, and without going off on too much of a tangent, does show one of the greatest things I would suggest about our parliamentary system, because so many of us, when we raise issues in this House, do so because they are brought to our attention by constituents in our surgeries, and this is one such case. Richard and Benny made a powerful, moving case to me, and I am only too pleased to raise this issue in front of Parliament today. So that point made during this debate is a reminder of the democratic rights and freedoms that we enjoy in this country, that Richard and Benny could come to see me and to make this point freely, knowing they won't be persecuted and knowing that their representative could and would take up that matter on their behalf. These are rights and freedoms which, sadly, are not enjoyed by too many people around the world. Now, Benny's story, I have to say, would bring a tear to the stoniest heart. Benny's father was, in fact, one of the representatives hand-picked in 1969 to vote in the Act of Free Choice. Benny says that he still remembers his father telling him how he had been threatened and told that he and his whole family would be killed if he voted for Papuan independence. During our meeting, Benny told me the tragic story which he says is permanently fixed in his memory. That's the story of when Benny, who was just 3 years old at the time, saw many of his fellow villagers, including most of his family, killed during an Indonesian military operation. Years later, Benny became the leader of the Papuan student independence movement. After being imprisoned, Benny was able to escape to Oxford, where he was duly granted political asylum by the United Kingdom. When I met Benny, he expressed with great emotion the gratitude that he felt to the United Kingdom and spoke with admiration for our values of freedom and the rule of law, principles he said that he is determined to see his people in West Papua enjoy. Benny was also the one who earlier this year presented a petition to the United Nations calling for an independence referendum in West Papua. The petition contained the signatures and thumbprints of some 1.8 million West Papuans, which represents approximately 70% of the entire population. I turn to the Minister. What is it that the government can do? I've explained the history and I've set out the present situation. So the question is, what can we do to ensure that the human rights situation improves in West Papua and that the future is a brighter one for the Papuan people? I accept that the United Kingdom's power is limited, but I do think there are two key areas where we could and should apply diplomatic pressure. We should not downplay our influence. The United Kingdom is a close and important friend of Indonesia. I understand that a recent BBC poll found that over 65% of Indonesians take a positive view of the UK's influence, making Indonesia the country with the second most favourable perception of the United Kingdom in Asia. So we do have a role to play in having these conversations with our Indonesian friends, difficult though they may be. Firstly, the issue of the Human Rights Commissioner for the United Nations. The first thing I would ask the Minister to consider doing is to push for the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to visit West Papua. This shouldn't be controversial. Indeed, in February 2018, meeting with the then UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zaid Ra'ad Al Hussein, Indonesian President Jokowi invited his office to visit West Papua. Sadly, 15 months on, this has not taken place. The former UN High Commissioner expressed concern about this in his update to the 38th session of the Human Rights Council. The Foreign Office and our representatives in the United Nations should therefore be encouraging their Indonesian counterparts to honour that invitation and permit the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to visit West Papua. Their assessment of human rights in West Papua will be critical in informing the world of the situation on the ground and bringing about positive change in the region. So I'd ask the Minister today if he would please commit to raising the issue of this invitation with his Indonesian counterpart and encourage it to be honoured. The second area where I would suggest, Mr Holloway, that the United Kingdom could have a positive influence is in pushing for increased press freedom in West Papua, particularly greater access for foreign journalists to visit the region. At present, foreign journalists are essentially banned from West Papua. The few who are granted access are closely monitored by the Indonesian military and by no means allowed to report freely. The BBC's Indonesia editor, Rebecca Henschke, was granted a special permit to report on a malnutrition crisis in the region last year, but was expelled shortly after arriving when she posted some tweets which, I quote, hurt the feelings of some soldiers. It is therefore unsurprising that Indonesia rates 124th out of 180 countries in the Press Freedom Charity Reporters Without Borders 2019 World Press Freedom Index. The charity has concluded that President Jokowi did not keep his campaign promises to address media freedom in West Papua, and instead his presidency has seen drastic restrictions on access for foreign journalists and growing violence against local journalists who seek to report on abuses by the Indonesian military. Mr. Hollowbone, a free press nurtures free societies, and now more than ever we must defend it. That was the message of the FCO, the Foreign Commonwealth Office, last week as we marked World Press Freedom Day. Never is that more true than in the case of West Papua. We simply must ensure that journalists are able to report freely in the region, shine a light on wrongdoings when they occur, and generally scrutinise the actions of the authorities in West Papua. Ensuring this will go a long way to help protecting the human rights of the West Papuan people, and the UK is in an ideal place to take action on this issue. Last month, the UK government announced that Amal Clooney had been made a special envoy on media freedom by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and will head up a panel of legal experts looking to repeal anti-press freedom laws abroad and ensure that journalists across the world are free to report the truth. I would therefore urge the Minister today, and the Foreign Secretary of course, to ensure that this important panel, when it's established, investigates the situation in West Papua as a top priority. The panel, which I think is a wonderful initiative, can look at the restrictive laws that the Indonesian government has in place in West Papua that have essentially created a media blackout in the region, and press the Indonesian government to repeal them, enable a free press, transparency and accountability in West Papua. The simple fact is that the human rights situation in West Papua cannot improve until President Jokowi has delivered on his promise to allow greater press freedom in the region, which has thus far failed to happen. This panel therefore represents a golden opportunity to hold the Indonesian government to their promises, ensure their warm words turn into hard action, and ultimately a free media can prevail in West Papua. I therefore hope that the Minister will be able to assure me in his remarks that he will make strong representations to the Foreign Secretary and Amal Clooney that West Papua must be an area of focus for the Defend Media Freedom panel. Yes.
He's been extremely generous. And will he add to his wish list that the British government uses all its efforts and influence in Indonesia to try and secure access for NGOs such as Amnesty International and the Red Cross in West Papua, because there's been some difficulty for them visiting the area to see what's going on in West Papua.
Yes, I'm grateful. That's a very sensible suggestion. I wonder if the Minister would indeed add that. Ultimately, I think what the Honourable Member and myself are looking for is transparency and access and freedom, all of which, of course, tie together. Yeah.
I wonder if he could add to his list of things that could be done, something that the University of Sydney has called for, which is a comprehensive investigation into the killing of Papuans by Indonesians, by Indonesian forces. Because at the moment, we are left with the Asian Human Rights Commission, who in 2013 produced a report that showed the savagery of the Indonesian forces in dealing with this.
Thank you. I'm grateful for that suggestion. I'm very keen that the Minister can take away from this 2 or 3 things that we may be able to achieve in the near future. I'm happy, of course, to add that request to the list as well. I think ultimately we're all making the same point, which is that an investigation carried out by, be it an NGO or be it by the press, achieves largely the same end, which is the transparency and the clarity and the understanding of what is taking place in West Papua. So I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for Henley for adding that suggestion to the list. So in conclusion, I leave the Minister with 2 modest requests from myself, and of course 2 others added from the floor of the House, but if followed through and achieved, I would suggest immensely significant requests. They ought not to be controversial, as they are essentially asking of the Indonesian government that it honours the promises that it has already made. That first request being that the Minister encourages his counterparts in the Indonesian government to honour that February 2018 invitation to the Office of the UN Commissioner of Human Rights to visit West Papua, and secondly, that the Minister ensures that the new FCO panel for press freedom investigates that situation in West Papua as a top priority. If we can ensure free access for the international media and independent human rights observers to West Papua, we will have taken an enormous step forward in protecting the human rights of the Papuan people, putting the region on the road towards a more free and prosperous future. I hope the Minister will be able to assure me and all the others who have come along to attend the debate today, and I note that the Chairman of the APPG is here as well, and I welcome him to this debate. I hope he will be able to assure all of us that he will take up these issues on behalf of the people of West Papua, whose cries for help have for far too long gone unanswered. Today's debate, Mr Followbone, has helped give a voice to the voiceless, and I hope that the Foreign Commonwealth Office will be able to help too. Thank you.
The question is, this House has considered human rights in West Papua. The debate can last until 5:30. I'm obliged to call the front bench spokespeople no later than 8 minutes past 5, and the guideline limits are 5 minutes for the SNP, 5 minutes for Her Majesty's Opposition, 10 minutes for the Minister, and if the Minister would allow Robert Courts 2 minutes at the end to sum up the debate, that would be fantastic. So until 8 minutes past 5, it's backbench time. 2 members are seeking to contribute, so there'll be a time limit of 6 minutes each. Alex Sobel.
We think we know all about the great injustice of the world. The people have been killed, their human rights transgressed, illegally imprisoned, and their call for right to self-determination answered. However, West Papua is the forgotten struggle. So I thank the Honourable Member for Whitney for giving us the opportunity to highlight the plight of West Papua, and his explanation of the history and an overview of the actions of successive Indonesian governments against West Papua and a number of requests he's already made to the Minister, which I shall add to. So I won't repeat any of those points, but I will, however, say that in the 50 years of Indonesian control, there's significant evidence of genocide, and Yale Law School, in a report for the Indonesian Human Rights Campaign 2004, found the available evidence a strong indication that the Indonesian government has committed genocide against the West Papuans. The Indonesian military have also carried out widespread acts of torture and sexual assault against the native Papuans, points I made in a debate yesterday about women's rights defenders. So the people of West Papua have been campaigning since 1969, and many have had to flee and campaign from their new homes. A united campaign representing all those in the West Papuan diaspora and in West Papua. The United Liberation Movement for West Papua was formed in 2014, bringing together all the campaigns. The Free West Papua campaign is based in the UK and supports the all-party parliamentary group on West Papua, which I chair. As the member for Whitney said, Benny Wender, who lives in Oxford, is the chair of the Free West Papua campaign and also the United Liberation Movement West Papua. I'd like to put on record my thanks to the Honourable Member for Oxford East and her predecessor Andrew Smith for their year's support for Benny and the campaign. The bringing together of the organisation led to 2 major steps forward. Recently, the first is the signing of the Westminster Declaration, which called for an internationally supervised vote for independence, was signed in 2016 by representatives of governments from 4 Pacific states and parliamentarians from around the world. Since then, other parliamentarians, including myself, have signed up the declaration. And as the Honourable Member for Whitney said, the West Papuans, in secret and often in fear of discovery, collected a petition calling for that right for independence and signed by 1.8 million people. And that petition has now been presented to the UN, and I thank the Minister for the meeting prior to that petition being presented and look forward to future meetings regarding the petition. But my main comments are going to be regarding the incidents in Nduga province. I recently met with the World Council of Churches on their return from West Papua, and they gave me a report on what was going on. The report highlighted that Indonesian security forces allegedly fired large-calibre machine guns and dropped grenades from helicopters in areas inhabited by indigenous local communities. While the Indonesian military continues to deny access to human rights organisations, journalists, human rights defenders and observers to the province, a rescue team consisting of local government and civil society representatives were able to collect data in some of the affected areas. According to the recent report, security forces killed at least 9 indigenous Papuans, while at least 5 indigenous Papuans, including 2 minors, have been reported missing since the commencement of military operations. Witnesses have stated that many displaced villagers continue to hide in the jungle, where they live in small groups in improvised huts. The men leave the shelter during the night and walk far distances to collect sweet potatoes and taro, under fear of murder. The harsh climate and food scarcity in Central Papuan Highlands have particularly affected women and children. And according to the local human rights defenders, at least 13 have died due to starvation after fleeing villages. I want to use this opportunity to highlight the fact that Indonesian armed forces have been accused of deploying chemical weapons suspected to be white phosphorus banned under international law in West Papua, the easternmost territory, international humanitarian law, because this is an issue of contention. Under the Convention on the Prohibition, Development, Production, Stockpile and Use of Chemical Weapons, and on their destruction, which Indonesia signed and ratified, and in fact sits on the committee, states are banned from using and stockpiling chemical weapons. ABC, which is the Australian equivalent of the BBC, reported in December that claims that wounds may be inflicted by white phosphorus, and reports had photos of the canisters and wounds. And I, in fact, have more photos from the World Council of Church, which I can provide the Minister. I wrote to the Minister regarding this, and the Minister responded to me. But I feel the Minister's letter could have, in fact, been written by the Indonesian Ministry of Information and Communication. The Indonesian Embassy wrote to me before I wrote to the Minister saying, I deeply regret that such motion was based on groundless reporting, most notably by Australia's The Saturday newspaper throughout its January to February 2019 articles. No significant evidence has been subsequently produced despite the strong claims made by the authors. In the Minister's letter, he wrote to me, we were aware of the media claim first made in the Saturday paper on 22nd of December 2018 about the possible use of white phosphorus. It wasn't the Saturday paper, which is a small, paper in Australia. It was ABC that reported this, and many other media outlets. I'm sure the Minister wouldn't want people to think that the United Kingdom Foreign Commonwealth Office was subservient to the Indonesian government on these matters. So I once again urge the Minister to write to the OPCW to investigate the issue as an international priority. I request the Minister immediately send an official request to the OPCW asking the organisation to verify the incident and investigate the suspected breach of Indonesia's obligation to the Chemical Weapons Convention. If no investigations are made, if no light is shone into the dark underbelly of military occupation of West Papua, Indonesia, how will we know what's going on? I just want to make one more point from the letter, before I finish, from the letter by the Minister, that he says the use of white phosphorus is not banned under international law, and I'd ask him whether the UK government isn't going to call for the banning of white phosphorus, because when it is used against civilians, it is a chemical weapon. It is exactly that type of weapon and should be banned under international law.
And also to follow the honourable gentleman for Leeds North West. Also, can I thank the honourable member for Whitney for securing the debate and for a very, very powerful contribution and setting the scene for us from his own interests as well. And also, it's a pleasure to see the Minister in this place and for his commitment to his role, which he carries out very, very well. And we often say it, but it's the truth. I very much look forward to hearing the Minister's remarks. I'm very interested, Mr Hollowborn, in human rights issues, always have been. It's been one of the big issues for me in my time in this House. I also chair the IPWP and freedom of religious belief, but today it's human rights issues I'm going to speak about, and I want to put those on record. And whether it's discrimination or abuse, emotional or physical or financial, I'm very happy to take whatever opportunity comes my way to speak up for those, as the honourable gentleman for Whitney said, a voice for the voiceless, to speak for those who no one else is speaking for, at least in this place. According to Amnesty International, the people of Papua are subject to severe human rights violation at the hands of Indonesian authorities. Amnesty's 2002 report on Indonesia found that counterinsurgency operations by security forces in West Papua had resulted in gross human rights violations, including extrajudicial executions, enforced disappearances, torture and arbitrary detentions. The honourable gentleman referred to the elections as well, and in Northern Ireland some time ago, in the early years of '69 and so on, thereabouts, there was a terminology used, gerrymandering. Gerrymandering the democratic process. It reminds me very much of that, except in this case, the result was very, very final. And by fixing the election by intimidation and threats of violence, as terrible as this is, the reality for West Papuans is even worse. A paper prepared by Yale Law School in 2004 found evidence that strongly indicates that the Indonesian government has committed genocide against West Papuans, and at the very least, the Indonesian government has committed crimes against humanity against them as well. Despite these crimes, authorities in West Papua operate with impunity. In March 2018, the mysterious death in police custody of Rico Ayomi, a 17-year-old student, for alleged alcohol poisoning, underscored the lack of accountability for deaths of Papuans by police. Security forces have been responsible for an estimated 95 deaths and 69 incidents from 2010 to 2018, in which 39 were related to peaceful political activities, such as demonstrations or raising the Papuan independence flag. No security force personnel have been convicted in civilian courts at all for those deaths, and with only a handful of cases leading to disciplinary measures or military trials. Quite simply, Mr Holloway, outrageous and unacceptable that none of these cases have been answered, and there needs to be access to those who committed out crimes to be brought to courts for their brutality and for those crimes. The brutality of the Indonesian government in cracking down on separatists has created an environment in which anyone suspected of supporting Papuan independence can become subject to human rights violations by police and security forces, including unlawful killing, torture and beating. Thus, the rights of West Papuans to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly are heavily curtailed. We speak for those people here in this debate today and make sure that their voices are being heard. Many people are imprisoned simply by having taken part in non-violent demonstrations or having expressed their opinions. Here we are expressing our opinion, and we can do it freely. Why shouldn't they be able to express their opinion? Similarly, international human rights organisations and journalists face restrictions, severe restrictions, on their ability to work freely and visit the area. Human Rights Watch report that just last year 2 foreign journalists were harassed for allegedly illegal reporting. BBC correspondent Rebecca Hensick, arrested in February, and Polish freelancer Jakub Fabian Zabriskie, arrested in August. The oppression of the media and the freedom of expression ensures the terrible oppression of West Papuans continues outside of the international community's awareness. I don't believe that we, as an international part of the international community, can sit back and not do something, and that's why this debate is so important. And that is why debates like this today and others in other parts of the world are so important. It is vital that we take every opportunity we have to publicly stand in solidarity with those who are suffering in West Papua, and to say to the Indonesian government that the world is watching you and that we will not simply forget. I believe the opportunity to speak for the people of West Papua has been given to us today. We do look to the Minister for his response, and we do hope that the influence that we can exert upon Indonesia can be one that brings about change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Holloway. And I'd like to thank and congratulate the honourable member for Whitney for bringing this debate. As he pointed out, it's the first ever. I think that's over time. I appreciated the remarks that he made, very powerful remarks that he's made. And I'm glad that they've now been put on the record, and I look forward to some of the points that he's raised with the Minister, who I know takes this seriously as well. As a member for Strangford has just said to us, I think it's important to have our voice, because we have to tell the Indonesian authorities that the world is watching and the world is paying attention. And it's important that we raise and highlight human rights violations, lack of self-determination, wherever they occur in the world, and that's what makes this debate on West Papua so timely today. In terms of human rights, the SNP unequivocally condemns any human rights violations, regardless where they occur in the world. We find it incredibly concerning, the reports that have come out about the human rights violations, as well as some reports that we've seen about the use of chemical weapons as well. And I reflect as well the comment that the honourable member made from the UN panel of experts in saying that this case reflects a widespread pattern of violence, alleged arbitrary arrests and detention, as well as methods amounting to torture used by the Indonesian police and military in Papua. That should be hugely concerning to all of us. And he was absolutely right, as other members have been, including the chair of the all-party group as well, and the good work that he and his colleagues are doing in pushing for a full investigation into this. In terms of self-determination, the the member was right that self-determination goes to the heart of this issue, and the right of people to choose how they are governed is a fundamental pillar of the international rules-based order. And any of us must have significant concern that the decision to unify with Indonesia and the act of free choice, as it was called, or the act of no choice, as others have referred to it, was made with 1 in 800 having the vote in that particular decision. And even those 1 in 800, as the members pointed out, and as Mr Wenda has testified as well, may not have been a free and fair vote either. So that brings us a very significant issue, and I'm wondering if the Minister will tell us what moves he has to raise that issue of self-determination, which is so important in this case, and what discussions he's had with Indonesian authorities, but also with representatives of West Papua as well, and wonder if he'll set that out. And I'll give way to my honourable friend, who I know is doing good work.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I apologise to the Chamber that I wasn't able to be here for the whole debate. I had commitments in committee and in the main Chamber, but I first met Benny Wenda several years ago when he visited the Scottish Parliament. He was hosted by our good friend Aileen Campbell, who is now a minister in the Scottish Government, and I had the pleasure of meeting again with him and his colleagues this morning. And that point about self-determination is absolutely crucial, that no matter what anybody's individual views on whether any given community should be an independent state or an independent country, the point is that the people who live there, who self-identify as part of that nation and that community, should have the right to a free and fair choice, and that's something that the SNP understandably has always been very proud to support.
I'd like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Glasgow North, for the point he raises, and I also want to say that Mr Wenda was very, very welcome in the Scottish Parliament, and always will be, and I hope he knows that. If I can also, in agreeing with my honourable friend for the member for Glasgow North, can I also add my voice to the key actions that were also raised in terms of pushing for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. That visit must take place, and I know that he will make that point in the strongest possible terms, and we'd ask the Minister to do so. And the press must also have the freedom to visit as well. If there's nothing to hide, then they should show that there is nothing to hide. And I think the member for Carmarthen and East Winford made a very, very good point, a good additional point, I think, in terms of letting international NGOs like Amnesty International and others be part of any delegation. I think that is important as well. I want to give scope for the Minister to respond. I know a number of good points have been made, but if I can add my voice to the points that have already been made, and I know that the Minister is hearing that loud and clear today. Thank you, Mr Hollowburn.
Goodman.
Thank you very much, Mr Hollowburn. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair this afternoon. I'd like to begin by congratulating the honourable member for Witney. He has raised here an extremely important issue, and he did it very well. I'd also like to congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Leeds North West, who is an extremely energetic champion for the people of West Papua. The honourable members have talked about the history, and I agree with their analysis, and we've had some discussion about the human rights situation. It is extremely disappointing that the human rights situation in West Papua is still so bad, because the human rights situation in other parts of Indonesia has improved very significantly as compared to 20 years ago. So one could have hoped that the people of West Papua would have benefited from that as well. There are a couple of particular issues that episodes that I want to raise. First of all, at the beginning of last December, more than 500 Papuans were arrested after peaceful demonstrations to commemorate the birth of the West Papuan nation in 1961. Days later, the West Papua Liberation Army militants attacked and killed over 20 construction workers in the Nduga region, and 300 villagers had to flee to escape the subsequent military sweep following this attack. The British government does have slightly more power, I think, than was suggested by the Honourable Member for Witney, because the UK is currently the penholder in the UN Security Council for the protection of civilians in armed conflict. Innocent West Papuans are clearly not getting the protection they so badly need and are being treated as legitimate targets by the Indonesian military. So I'd be grateful if the Minister would explain what his department is doing in this role.
So the incident my honourable friend has described in the letter to me from the Minister described it as proportionate. Would you describe the actions of the Indonesian army as proportionate or disproportionate?
Most clearly disproportionate. I want to talk about the use of white phosphorus. I believe that I believe this story, that white phosphorus was used inappropriately. And I believe it because I had a meeting with Octavianus Moat, who's the Deputy Chairman and former General Secretary of the United Liberation of West Papua, who had had direct testimony from people in this area, and with Ian Martin, who was the former head of the UN mission, which conducted the self-determination referendum in East Timor. I think we need to be really specific about this. White phosphorus is not classed as banned under the Chemical Weapons Convention, but its military use is circumscribed by Protocol 3 of the UN Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. It is, however, prohibited in all circumstances to use it against civilians. It is also prohibited to make any military objective located within a concentration of civilians the object of attack by air-delivered incendiary weapons, which is what happened on this occasion. So I support entirely those calls to send in experts from the UN and the OPCW to look at what happened. I heard stories of old people being burned out of their homes by this. I'd also like to ask the Minister to do some further things. I'd like him to ensure or to suggest to the Indonesian military, who seem to be out of control in West Papua, that peacekeeping duties be assigned instead to the local police. As well as the UN-led investigation into white phosphorus, what we need to see is the release of political prisoners, the recognition of local political parties to facilitate the development of a political and civil society in West Papua. And I would hope also that the government would review any sales of military equipment to Indonesia from this country.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Holloway. It's always a pleasure to be under your chairmanship. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, the member for Witney, for securing this very important debate today. Also grateful for the insights and contributions of the honourable gentleman for Leeds North West and Strangford, and indeed for the front bench contributions. And I'll endeavour to answer all the questions, and those that I don't, I will obviously do so in writing subsequently. Now, this year marks the 70th anniversary of diplomatic relations between the UK and Indonesia. I'm very pleased to say that the relationship is flourishing. Indonesia is an important democratic partner in the G20 and for the next 2 years on the UN Security Council. It's in this context, of course, that we follow very seriously the situation in Papua. We welcome President Joko Widodo's commitment to a peaceful and prosperous Papua. However, we also recognise the challenges, the historic challenges are significant. Many stem, of course, from the disputes over resources and governance referred to by my honourable friend in his first speech, and from unresolved human rights grievances. Whilst the UK government wholeheartedly respects the territorial integrity of Indonesia, with the province of Papua and West Papua as integral parts, it is, I think, important that within this framework the authorities address the needs and aspirations of the Papuan people. We are concerned by the sporadic outbreaks of violence in Papua and by reports of alleged human rights violations by the security forces. We do and will continue to press the Indonesian authorities to strengthen their human rights protection and to address the legitimate concerns of the people, including by ensuring that they benefit from sustainable and equitable development. And indeed, the issues raised by the Honourable Lady for Bishop Auckland in relation to the building of a civic society that allows free political parties. There are serious and long-standing concerns about the influence and actions of the Indonesian security forces in Papua. And I believe, and I know that the Foreign and Commonwealth Office believes, that it is regrettable that despite improvements since the restoration of democracy in Indonesia in 1998, there remain persistent reporting of worrying human rights violations in Papua. Meanwhile, there has been no real accountability for the serious abuses of the past. When I met with the Indonesian ambassador to London in January, I raised these issues with him, not least because I very recently had a meeting with the all-party group. And in light of the contemporary violence in Ndunga, where armed groups had attacked construction workers, resulting in the deaths of 19 people. We urged the authorities in Indonesia then to ensure that any security response would be proportionate. Under successive democratically elected governments, there has been, as has been rightly, and I think rightly in university recognised, a noticeable improvement in the overall human rights situation across Indonesia as a whole, and an end to the very debilitating conflicts in East Timor, in Aceh, in Ambon and elsewhere. Now, during their recent phone call, the UK Prime Minister praised the President of Indonesia for the peaceful conduct of the presidential and legislative elections in April, which represented the single largest one-day democratic event anywhere in the world, with some 80% voter turnout and more than 800,000 polling stations operating across the archipelago. Whilst there were some localised delays to polling, including in Papua, there has, in my view, been no evidence to suggest that this has been anything other than a well-run and credible election. Nevertheless, I can say to the House that we shall continue to raise our concerns about issues such as freedom of expression and assembly, as well as the rights of persons belonging to minorities. Now, in reference to media freedom in Papua, brought up by a number of members here, UK officials regularly raise the importance of media access to Papua with the Indonesian government, and we will continue to do so. Our embassy in Jakarta is active in promoting press freedom across the entirety of Indonesia, where there is already a vibrant media environment. To mark World Press Freedom Day last week, the embassy arranged a full programme of activities to celebrate the work of Indonesia's journalists, media organisations and regulators in this regard. However, whilst President Jokowi has said that foreign journalists should be allowed access to Papua without preconditions, unfortunately, we also understand that Indonesian officials continue to place substantial practical obstacles in the way of this taking place. Transparency and media access are important to give us all a full picture of the situation, and we also encourage all Indonesian journalists to write openly and frankly about Papua to ensure that all local perspectives are properly heard and are part of that debate. Now, on the point made by my honourable friend for Whitney about the Defend Media Freedoms panel, this panel has not yet had its first meeting, as we understand, but it will be for its members to determine its work and plan the initial areas of focus. It would, of course, not be appropriate for the UK government to seek to dictate these, as in many ways I think it would undermine that sense of independence that is important. But we also regularly press for the release of political prisoners across Papua. Under President Jokowi, the number has fallen from 37 in 2014 to fewer than 10 today. Now, both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have acknowledged this positive trend, but we continue to make the case that 10 political prisoners remains 10 too many. However, we are concerned that 3 people charged with treason in January 2019, having apparently taken part in a peaceful prayer event. We call here and now for all political prisoners to be released immediately and for the Indonesian authorities to ensure that all detainees are given the right to a fair trial. We will continue to request updates on the historic human rights cases in Papua that I think President Jokowi has committed to resolve, and we will keep that pressure up in the aftermath of the elections. Initial investigations have been conducted by the National Commission on Human Rights, but these need to be properly dealt with by the Attorney General's office. May I turn just briefly to the issue on phosphorus? And I am happy to have further conversations with both the Honourable Lady for Bishop-Auckland and the Honourable Gentleman for Leeds North West on this issue. I have to say that our own investigations have not substantiated the media claims that it was used in violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. As was rightly pointed out, it is prohibited in all cases against civilians. Therefore, we do not believe there is a case for referral to the OPCW. But I am more than happy to look at any further additional written or other evidence that the Honourable Gentleman has on this matter. And clearly, we will be happy then to take this matter up. As has been pointed out, President Jokowi has visited Papua 10 times during his first term, far more than any previous Indonesian president. He's made a number of important democratic commitments, including to establishing a constructive political dialogue with Papuan groups. This process represents, I think, a credible opportunity to address long-held grievances, and our discussions with the Indonesian government, we will urge them to deliver on these commitments. I very much hope that the recent sad but peaceful passing of Pastor Neles Tebar, the Papuan priest who has been at the forefront of attempts to create a peaceful dialogue on the future of Papua, might inspire progress to honour his legacy, led by the team that the President has appointed to foster a dialogue. I agree that the Act of Free Choice was an utterly flawed process, but I have to say to my honourable friend for Witney and indeed to the House that there is no desire in the international community for reopening this question. The UK, along with other members of the UN, very much supports Indonesia's territorial integrity. We will continue to support efforts by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and her officials to arrange this visit to Papua at the invitation of the Indonesian government. Officials in our embassy in Jakarta have discussed this proposed visit with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and encourage Indonesia to agree dates as soon as possible. I will also undertake now to raise this proposed visit with my Indonesian counterparts, and I hope to make a visit, a quite substantially long visit to Indonesia later in the year. Facilitating the visit to Papua, I think, would help the Indonesian government demonstrate their commitment to the rights and freedoms of those residing in Papua. It would also help underline the seriousness with which they take their candidacy for a seat on the Human Rights Council. And as I say, as a member of the UN Security Council, it also provides an opportunity for us to speak fairly openly at New York on this issue. Mr. Colburn, it is clear that economic factors are a major source of grievance amongst the Papuan people and a source of strain in their relationship with the central government and local authorities. That's why we shall continue to support Indonesia's regional governments to develop a green economy in which people can make a living without over-exploiting their natural resources, and in which there is greater regulatory oversight of the timber industry, which of course has been so fundamentally linked to this social conflict. Let me end, Mr. Holoban, by saying this. This government will continue to take a close interest in human rights in Papua. I'm very pleased there are a number of MPs who are very passionate about this. I very much enjoy their passion. I think it provides us with the opportunity of making a serious case to our Indonesian counterparts, which we will do. And above all, we think that this expression of interest is in the interest of all the people of Papua and indeed for the rest of Indonesia.
Thank you. Robert, please.
Thank you, Solomon, and thank the Minister for that full and comprehensive responses. I thank every other member for having taken part in the debate. And may I welcome once again Benny Wender and my constituent Richard Samuelson for having raised this debate today. And I hope it's one that they, sitting in the public gallery, have found has advanced the cause of human rights in West Papua. I'm grateful to all honourable members for having made the points that they have. From honourable friend for Leeds North West for the robust response from the FCO, I think it's probably we can summarise him saying, honourable member for Strangford with regards to access to justice, the honourable member for North East Fife for underlining my points about the visit of the Human Rights Commissioner and press freedom, and also for the political prisoners point that's been raised by the honourable lady for Bishop Auckland. Can I assure the Minister, I hear very much everything he says. I'm very glad that the issue of press freedom is regularly raised by the FCO. I'd really just underline the point that the issue of the Act of Free Choice lies at the heart of the feeling of repression, well, the real repression, and the feeling of injustice that there is that lies very much at the heart of this cause. As we have the 70th year of diplomatic relations, I hope that the Minister and the FSO will continue and will redouble the efforts, having heard how strongly members feel in the House. As regards to the Defend Media Freedom panel, I understand, of course, the independence. I don't ask that the UK dictates, merely that it suggests, having heard the strength of feeling here. We have made great strides forward today. I'm very grateful, Mr Hollowbone, for having listened to us all in detail. We have cast a searching gaze upon the human rights situation in West Papua. We must ensure that we do not look away.
The question is that this House has considered human rights in West Papua. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.